welcome to today's event on transparency and corporate social responsibility, brought to you by the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law and Policy, a collaboration between the UCLA School of Law and the Samuel School of Engineering, whose mission is to foster research and analysis to ensure that new technologies are developed, implemented, and regulated in ways that are socially beneficial, equitable, and accountable, and by the Lowell Milken Institute, an academic center at UCLA Law that works with business law faculty to develop business law curriculum and co-curricular programs to train the next generation of business lawyers and leaders. My name is Michael Carey-Nicholas. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Technology, Law and Policy. I will begin by acknowledging UCLA's presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tonga peoples. Transparency is a word that gets thrown around a lot these days. Everybody seems to be a fan of it. And partly one of the reasons why it's such a common reference point is because it's a somewhat amorphous concept, which can mean very different things to very different people, and which therefore lends itself to application to a lot of radically different ideas about governance or how to structure or organizational structure. But I think it's also because transparency is the first step to any solution that involves meaningful engagement, accountability, or improvement, which is supported or driven by external forces. Any solution to structural challenges needs to begin by understanding the problem, right? And so because that understanding has to come before meaningful recommendations for reform, that's one of the reasons why everybody comes back to transparency. And content moderation is a great example here, where we constantly hear transparency being thrown around, not because transparency is this wonderful panacea that will solve all of the problems that we see online, but because until we get a proper understanding of what's going on in that black box of content moderation, we can't even begin to address these kinds of issues. And I use that as one example, but I think that a similar thing is true for algorithmic transparency around combating discriminatory outcomes, transparency with regard to global markets for personal data. If we want to address the problem, we need to understand the problem, and understanding that problem brings us back to that core challenge of transparency. And I think that that is particularly true of any avenues of progress that involve corporate social responsibility. I think it's one thing where you have a government mandate that essentially says, you, company X, will do this, and we will be watching to make sure that you do this. And if we find that you do not do this, there will be these kinds of consequences. That's one thing. But where you have companies or private sector entities voluntarily taking any particular initiative, it's very difficult for outsiders to assess how meaningful their actions are, if they're doing what they claim to be doing. And again, that's what brings us back to transparency and the subject that we're going to be discussing today in terms of the relationship between transparency and corporate social responsibility. We have an incredible panel, which I will briefly introduce. Greg Waters is the Associate Director of Research and the Sector Lead for the Technology and Communications sector at SASB Standards, where he supervises technical staff on the research team and provides oversight on technical staff's execution of standard-setting activities, sector coverage, and organizational projects. Natalie Marikal is the Senior Policy and Partnerships Manager at Ranking Digital Rights. She leads the development of RDR's policy positions, coordinates stakeholder engagement and partnerships, and publicly represents RDR with the media and at conferences around the world. And Lynn Lepucki is the Security Pacific Bank Distinguished Professor of Law at UCLA. Lynn has written extensively on law-related information systems, and his stakeholder takeover project is an effort to provide potential corporate stakeholders, including customers, employees, suppliers, creditors, investors, managers, communities, and the public, with the information flow they need to control corporations through markets. We're going to start with a sort of first round of longer form questions, not very long, but to allow each of our panelists to sort of introduce their perspectives on this issue. I would encourage folks in our audience to enter any questions or comments there in the chat below, because we are planning on allowing about 20 to 30 minutes at the end for Q&A, probably between the top of the hour and 1:30 Pacific time. Also, if you're interested in raising your hand, we're happy to start up a queue at any point if folks want to directly engage during that Q&A period. So please don't be shy and jump in, because we're hoping that this is as interactive as it can be. So in terms of our first sort of round of kind of introductory questions, I'd like to start with Greg, if possible. You've worked across a number of different corporate contexts. Do you want to start maybe with a framing of the discussion, offering your views on the role of transparency in promoting good governance and socially responsible behavior, particularly in the technology and communications sector?
Yeah, sure thing. Well, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here and looking forward to the discussion. I think just for a little bit of context, I think just my perspective is largely informed from the work I do with the SASB standards, which, as some of you may know, but others maybe not, we are an investor-oriented disclosure set of standards that focus on environmental and social issues, and that's certainly things like content moderation would fall under that remit of kind of business relevant activities that kind of have social implications. And a lot of this work is really informed by the work of financial accounting standard setters. That's kind of how our due process is oriented. It's around organizations like the FASB and the International Accounting Standards Board, which is obviously a pretty specific context, but I think as I'll talk about, maybe somewhat helpful to show how I think about some of this stuff. And I think, like you mentioned, right, transparency can mean different things to different people. And I think alongside of that, there are different objectives when we talk about transparency. So one of them, like you said, is, kind of this link to accountability and, ensuring good governance. Another, though, I think, if you look at financial accounting standard setting, I think that primary objective, I think, if you look at Securities Act of 33 and 34, probably more around protection of investor interests specifically, right? It's a little bit different in some ways. And I think while there are obviously limitations, particular to, kind of settling in and just looking at investor interests and their financial interests in particular, obviously not the perfect model for everything. But I think that there is an argument that the kind of the regime that is starting to emerge in some ways is actually a pretty good roadmap for what we might aspire to in some areas that are still emerging around things like content moderation. And I think I would probably use an example of things like, just some of the SEC rules around corporate governance, where, we have a shared understanding of what the expectations are of what's going to be disclosed. We have, they're not voluntary, they are involuntary, which does help, obviously. And I think that type of transparency, what it means is that you can kind of, especially if it's across an entire group of companies, is that you can kind of really help frame engagements, and you can also kind of determine who your engagement targets should be. And I think that's kind of an element where we've kind of a bit more maturity there than necessarily we have here. Other objectives for transparency, though, there's quite a few. So I think another is, just the idea that transparency itself could actually drive performance. So that's kind of one of the things that really is oriented, or SASB's work is the idea that, for example, performance on climate issues, if you can't really know how companies are doing until they're all disclosing what their emissions are in a comparable way, industry by industry, right? And lastly, I would just draw attention to what's happening right now in the reporting space. Some really pretty big developments. I think if you look at what the European Commission is doing through the FRAG and through the SFDR, they are using transparency really as a means to pursue specific policy objectives on things like human rights and climate. That's, again, slightly different than just straight accountability and kind of trying to make sense of some of these challenging issues. So I think all of that is just kind of maybe helpful in thinking through some of these things. I think the objectives of the disclosure request is going to impact who the target audience is, and the target audience is going to influence what the appropriate level of elevation for those disclosures are. Because I think is what we could probably get into details here, especially in something like content moderation, the level of elevation really matters. Of course, the policies and procedures and governance at the high level is important, but I think we have to get a lot more granular to get a true understanding of what's happening. And I think if you look at some of the requests, we're kind of now at the point of talking about, well, just give us everything, show us the entire, just show us the code that you're using to sort content by, right? So I think, there's the objective and the target audience, I think, kind of play a role in determining what type of transparency is even desirable. Because, okay, you get the code, is that actually helpful for anyone in terms of determining what the right outcomes are? So really looking forward to discussing this a little bit more. And I think the last thing I'll sprinkle in at top is, at the risk of sounding a bit self-serving, is in light of the European Commission's moves, in light of the International Sustainability Standards Board be announced by the IFRS Foundation, which is actually going to acquire our current parent that working for the SASB standards. I think that there is really a place here for civil society and for others to ramp up their engagement with the standard setting process, because a future where disclosure requirements have teeth is not that far away. And the more that standard setters have in terms of expertise input from folks like Natalie, who's been kind enough to provide her input on some of the work that we've done. That type of input is just critical in actually scoping these challenges correctly, and therefore eventually kind of translating into what are appropriate standards that should be developed on some of these really challenging issues. So thanks for allowing me to be here.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a great framing, and I'm strongly in agreement with the idea that this is certainly an expanding space that's expanding and escalating rapidly. I'd like to go to Lynn next. One of the ongoing themes that we've had in a lot of our programming this year, or a lot of the ITFE programming, I should say, this year, has been around corporate accountability. Do you want to maybe introduce the stakeholder takeover project, as well as the role of disclosures and transparency in this idea?
Yes. People want corporations to change. When they're surveyed, they want to work for responsible corporations. They want to buy from responsible corporations. If they're suppliers, they want to partner with. They want to supply to responsible corporations. Investors want to put their money into responsible corporations. And stakeholders, potential stakeholders, I'm talking about the people now in the situation where they're not stakeholders who already work for the company or already are investors in the company, but rather they're people. Think of them as people making the decision whether or not they want to be part of this corporation. At that point, if you think about it, the corporation's looking to them for everything. There's nothing really inside the corporation. All these people, all of these participants in production are outside the corporation making decisions, and they have in the aggregate the power to change the corporation, to make it what they want it to be, a responsible corporation. Now, why hasn't this already occurred? Well, there are lots of corporate social responsibility reports out there. Nearly every company has one today, but they don't provide any useful information because it's not structured. So there is a change going on right now, and I'm really glad that Greg is here because he's right at the center of it and can tell us more about how it's going to work. But this change requires standardized information. That's the key to it. And the system is almost done. We're at a crucial stage where we're going to have to choose between what some people call single materiality, which is we're making a system to give investors the information they need to deal with corporations, versus double materiality. We're giving the public, we're giving all the potential stakeholders and the investors the information that they need. And I'm on the public side of this thing.
Fantastic. So let's go to Natalie next. I think there was a couple of references to civil society, and certainly I think transparency is the lifeblood of any accountability programming that's done on the civil society side. Do you want to introduce RDR or the Corporate Accountability Index, as well as the role of private sector disclosures in this work, and any challenges you face carrying out assessments under the current framework?
There you go. Yeah, you have to unmute me. I can't unmute myself. Hey everyone, and thanks so much for joining this conversation today. So I want to start by telling you a bit about RDR and what you do, and then kind of zoom out to the bigger picture of how transparency can enable accountability, and how civil society in particular can take advantage of transparency reports and derivative products thereof. So Ranking Digital Rights is a nonprofit research initiative. We're housed within a think tank in DC called New America. And I'm dropping the link to our webpage here. And our mission is to push big tech and big telecom platforms to respect people's human rights around the world. Seems like a simple mission. There's a lot that goes into it, of course. Our main research output is the Corporate Accountability Index, and I'm going to drop the link to our latest edition that came out in February of last year, based on 2020 data. And we take a look at 26 of the world's most powerful tech companies, and we score them on the basis of a normative framework that's grounded in international human rights standards, looking specifically at corporate governance, freedom of expression, and privacy to determine how well these companies do at protecting these rights on the basis of their publicly available policies and disclosures. And that's really key there. One, because methodologically, we don't have a magic ball, much less super powerful subpoena powers or any kind of subpoena powers to compel private companies to show us what happens inside their corporate black box, right? So we can only conduct our measurements on the basis of what companies disclose externally. But more philosophically, we believe that the answers to these questions are things that everyone has a right to know. We have a right to know as users, as potential users, as citizens in a democracy, as for those of us who do not live in democracies, not speaking for myself, but there may be people on the call who do not live in democracies. As members of an international community, we have the right to know what the rules are for participating in a social media platform, how the company goes about enforcing those rules, what data they collect, how they collect it, for what purpose they collect it, and so on and so forth. And so if you click around here, you can see that we have detailed report cards for each of the companies that we rank. I'm not going to go into detail on here because we could be here all night very easily. But I want to talk about two big barriers that we have to doing this work for holding companies accountable. The first is that there's no organization, certainly not one of our size. We have 15 staff in about a half dozen countries around the world, is going to be able to evaluate all the companies that influence our daily lives online. So, we look at 26, we cover about half of the world's internet users with that, but that's not nearly everything. But fortunately, we're able to partner with a bunch of civil society organizations around the world to adapt our methodology to look at different companies, or sometimes the same companies, their operations in different markets. And I dropped a link here to some examples of these adaptations that we do. So if you or someone works with a civil society organization that might be interested in doing this sort of work, you can get in touch with us, and I'll make sure to drop our contact information in the chat at some point. The second barrier, and the one that I think is most analytically interesting, is that companies lie in their disclosures. I know it's hard to believe. Can you imagine that companies might lie to people? And we don't have a really good systematic way of finding that out, except when whistleblowers are able to show that there are discrepancies between what companies say they do and what their internal processes actually are. And so we published a piece last month cross-checking Facebook's public disclosures about its policies against some of the practices that were revealed by Frances Haugen's complaints to the SEC and reporting by various news organizations. And so in other cases, we rely on investigative journalists to go in and figure out, like, Google says that people can control whether or not Google Maps collects their information, their location information. Turns out that wasn't true. Even if you opted out of that, Google still collected your information and used it for maps. And the Associated Press discovered that a few years ago and wrote a story about it. And Google did not change its practice, but it did change its disclosure. So you still can't control whether or not Google collects your location information, but at least they're not lying about it anymore. So, that's an improvement. I want to pick up on something that Michael said, which is that transparency is a necessary first step for accountability. In and of itself, it is not accountability. And I think it's really, really important to be clear about that. So what we do with the Corporate Accountability Index is that we force companies to be on the record to make a claim that they follow a practice. And most of the time, they're going to try to spin that in the best possible light. But so sometimes they're going to lie, right? Or, mislead, dissemble, there's all kinds of nice nuanced words that we can use instead of lie, but I like lie. But when they do lie, we're able to catch them in a lie and call them out on it and pressure them to change. That's not something you can do if they're not saying anything in the first place. I'll stop here because I'm going to die of a cough very soon.
No, that's a really good framing. I think from there, I'd like to start sort of by zooming out a bit, especially because some of your interventions have mentioned one another. And I think that it might be useful to start by thinking more broadly about the kind of broader accountability ecosystem, which I think is sort of the endpoint where you were leading us to as well. I wonder if each of you wants to start sort of by thinking about where the different initiatives that we've heard from, both your own and potentially, if you're comfortable, the others, where they fit into the broader kind of social and regulatory context of efforts to support better behavior by companies. Does anybody want to jump in, or should I call on someone?
Well, I would say, first of all, that all three of us are engaged in essentially the same thing. We're asking corporations to give us information so that we can use it against them, would be one interpretation of it. We're doing it in different ways, and so there are some contradictions. I already mentioned one of them, this single materiality versus double materiality. I'd like to hear what Greg has to say about this particular point, that if, for example, the planet were destroyed as a result of corporate irresponsibility, but no investors lost money, would that be mission accomplished for SASB? Or are you trying to do something else? I'll state my objections to Natalie later.
Yeah,
sorry. To the RDR ranking of Twitter #1.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think framing wise, I know I'm not sure that I would agree that it's a versus situation when it comes to single and double. I think really the future state is going to be where we have a regime where the full range of stakeholders has access to information on human rights performance, climate performance, et cetera. There's probably still going to be a subset of that information that is most relevant or of interest to investors because it's the most impactful on how companies perform. So I think that's the pushback I would give you there, Professor, is just around, kind of whether it's one or the other. I think we need both, for some of which you've already outlined. But I think even if we were in a world where somehow we lost out on the ability of this double materiality, which is not going to happen. I think it's pretty clear that it's a really important piece of transparency overall. We're interested we're interested in setting standards on issues that impact corporate valuation. Now, climate change is going to impact corporate valuation and enterprise value creation across the board, across all sectors. There's going to be some winners and there's going to be some losers. I think, be it because of the regulatory risk or just the physical risk of their actual assets, whether they're stranded because of regulations or if they're literally underwater, it's going to have financial impacts on companies going forward. And I think for that reason, it is true that I think, to use the language, as you said, I wouldn't say that we are interested in using information against companies. I think we're trying to be a lot more, in terms of our approach, it's much more neutral. There's no value judgment in what we're trying to do. It's much more around how do we design a set of disclosures or a set of metrics that would capture a variety of performance on a given topic. So it's not to say we, as SASB, are going to say that all the high emitting industries are bad, low emitting ones are good. I think we can also agree that there's some low emitting industries that have a whole lot of challenges on their own. It's rather, how can we at least can we parse out differences in companies and approaches? And I think that there's a real value prop in, even if we were to, it's not the ideal state here, but I think just generally speaking, the idea that we could, in a future state, see who are the worst, who are the highest emitters in a given industry relative to their peers, and see that type of improvement in performance, I think that alone could probably mitigate quite a bit of the worst behavior. Would it be an ideal future state? I think it's worth considering that very low bar, which I aspire to, I think our organization aspires to a lot more than that, but even the impact of identifying the laggards, as it were, and seeing the pressure that can be put on them by investors or by civil society, I think that is, there's a real case there.
If you take climate change, for example, right now, substantially all companies report to the greenhouse gas protocol. It applies to all the companies. If SASB's standards were adopted, there would not be greenhouse gas reporting for most of the industries. And there wouldn't be there'd be energy usage disclosure instead of scope 2 disclosure that the whole rest of the world is doing. SASB allows the greenhouse gas reporting to go on. They specifically say that's fine if the companies want to do the rest of this. But if the SEC adopted SASB standards, half of greenhouse gas disclosure would disappear. Not half of the emissions, that you're covering the emissions pretty well in total emissions, but half of the company's data would disappear.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you said, this is about emissions. So we're focused on the high emitting industries where that financial risk is located. Because I think, we could probably agree, right? I don't think that many people, or at least that many investors, would argue that a bank's greenhouse gas, scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions, or even their purchased electricity, is really what is their impact on climate change. It's their financing of fossil fuels companies that is of interest to society and to investors. And that's why the standard, which is designed to be the minimum set of information that a reasonable investor might have, is set up that way. So I think I'm not going to push back on the fact that there's not currently scope 1 emissions in every industry. That is true in our current standards. But I think if you look at where the emissions are happening, I think we're in a pretty defensible place there. That said, obviously there's a lot of interest in this information across, I think, investors more and more, and that's something that we're evaluating. And of course, with the establishment of this new ISSB and this establishment of what we're calling this thematic climate standard, I think those concerns might not really apply to a future state as these SASB standards eventually become the ISSB standards. So, certainly duly noted, but I do think that we covers this stuff pretty well.
So I want to go to Natalie now. I'm not sure if you want to speak to the original question, or there was a discussion of Twitter in the RDR index. So, but I'm fine with you taking that in either direction.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from Lynn what your questions or objections are about Twitter's score in last year's ranking.
Yeah, Twitter ranks #1 for information, for freedom of expression in 2020. This year, this is the year when Twitter canceled the Twitter account of the President of the United States, leaving the president without his usual means of communication with the American people. So it seemed a little odd to me, and I went on the website and looked at the criteria, and the criteria didn't seem to include whether you let people speak. It seemed to only include a lot of procedural matters. How are you governing, and what sort of rules did you have, and how transparent were you with regard to what your rules were? And I feel a need. I have the feeling, I'm not a Trumper, but I have the feeling that I'm close behind Trump in who a society might like to shut down. So I really fear that this thing is coming for me at some point. Content mediation is a really frightening term to me.
Content moderation.
Sorry, moderation, yeah.
Yeah. Sure. So let's zoom out here a little bit, and I'll drop a link to Twitter's report card, so folks can look and see the specifics here. The first thing I'll point out is that Twitter did get the highest score in this year's index, but that score was 53%. Now that's not a passing grade in any school that I've attended, and I was in school for probably 3/4 of my life. So that's the first thing. So it's not that Twitter is extraordinarily transparent, it's that the other companies we rank are extraordinarily opaque. So that's the first thing, right? The second thing is that the standards against which all the companies are ranked are a set of indicators that are, again, grounded in international human rights standards, right? And in best broadly acknowledged best practices in corporate governance. That we can, with confidence, apply to a really, really broad mix of companies around the world. And so the group of 26 is extremely diverse in terms of what markets they're based in and operate in terms of what products and services they offer, and in terms of their business models and their corporate governance structures, right? So there's a lot of stuff here that would be really relevant for the specific case of a microblogging site headquartered in the United States that is not primarily, but that is highly used by politicians, journalists, and other public figures, right? But the standards that we would apply specifically to that use case would not apply to, say, Amazon or a Russian social media company or Samsung or any number of telcos around the world, right? So because we're really trying to compare apples to oranges, there are certain types of questions that we can't go in here, that we can't include in our measurement tool, right? But the other question that you raised that I think is the really interesting one is whether content moderation is legitimate, right? I think that's the question that you're asking. Is it legitimate for a social media platform, be it Twitter or Facebook or Kakao or Vkontakte or and one of the others that we rank or others that are out there to remove a piece of content posted by a user, to determine how widely viewed or viewable a particular piece of content is by other users on the platform, or to even remove a particular user from the platform. And our conclusion, and this is the prevailing view in the internet policy and human rights field, including by organizations that many would consider very laissez-faire when it comes to free speech, and maybe even have a slight cyber libertarian bent, is that yes, there are circumstances under which all of these things are acceptable and may even be necessary for in service of running a platform that users would want to use in terms of protecting various public interests, including international human rights standards. So, in the case of Donald Trump, my problem with Twitter is that they didn't do it earlier, because he had been violating the platform's terms of service, which prohibit things like serious incidences of hate speech, incitement to violence, and so on and so forth. In the same way that it would remove me if I was threatening people with violence, I think it made the correct decision here. Though I don't think what the purpose of this particular event is to relitigate that debate.
Yeah, it doesn't matter though that he's the president of the United States.
It matters. I think it matters more. I think people who are in a position of power like his have an increased responsibility to not engage in incitement. And so that raises the question of Facebook's CrossCheck program, which was revealed in the Facebook papers earlier this fall, that showed that Facebook had an explicit policy to exempt from its community standards thousands of high-profile accounts, meaning that the people who had the greatest responsibility to avoid abusing other people on the platform, encouraging physical violence and so on, were giving a free pass to do just that. And I think that's exactly backwards.
So I feel like
I think we are going a little bit off topic though.
Well, it is slightly. I feel like where this conversation kind of between the two of you sort of ends up is there's a fundamental disconnect or conflict between American understandings of freedom of speech and the international human rights law framework. And I know this and think it's worth emphasizing this because as an international myself, like I bang my head against this wall every day in these conversations. And I think that, under the international standard, an appropriately enforced hate speech law, to bring it back to the governmental standard, because there's another disconnect between nation state rules and platform rules, which is going to drag us even further off course. But, if you have an appropriately enforced hate speech law within the international human rights law framework, that is absolutely appropriate and not considered an infringement on freedom of expression in the least. Now, again, that may be anathema to the American free speech understanding, but I think that is the origin of a lot of this potential disconnect. Is right.
That Michael, very quickly, there's an additional disconnect here between within the American legal system between the First Amendment speech rights of Twitter as a company that has a First Amendment right to moderate content on its platform versus free speech rights of any given user on the platform.
The real problem, it seems to me, is the use of the term freedom of expression. That as long as you don't say freedom of expression, if you say instead content moderation, or I would call it censorship. I think that's the term that everybody understands what it means. Content moderation, I don't know whether how many people understand what it means, but content moderation is the opposite of freedom of expression. Freedom of expression is people get to talk, and if there are viewpoints, they can be brought out. They can't be prejudged and declared to be hate speech or some other category of prohibited expression. You're just changing the meanings of the words, I think.
Right.
I'm going to let Natalie respond, and then I'm going to drag us back to transparency.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. No, I mean, it's not that we're twisting the words, it's that we're using a different definition of freedom of expression than the one that you're using. We're using the definition under international human rights law, where there are limits on freedom of expression, as long as they're procedural and justified under those standards. I do take your point about calling this entire category of indicators of standards and scores in our in our ranking, freedom of expression. Content moderation is not the only topic that's addressed in there. There's a bunch of other issues in there, and I have to say that when we created the standard back in 2014, 2015, the phrase content moderation had not taken off in the way that it has in the years since then, to denote this particular field of research and of practice around the governance of speech on social media platforms. And I do think I take your point as well about content moderation being kind of a jargony word used to mean censorship. That's true in a lot of contexts. In the specific kind of wonky, practitioner context in which it's used the most, people find it really useful to draw a distinction between speech restrictions that are conducted or directed by governments, which people do refer to as censorship, versus restrictions that are done on the initiative of the platforms themselves, right? So when they say that we don't want certain types of content that are lawful but awful is kind of the phrase that I think Daphne Keller is the one who popularized it. But Michael, let's go back to
we can go back to this at the end if there is time during the Q&A. I would like to go back to something that Greg said earlier, particularly around the material costs associated with social harms, because I hear that argument made a lot. I have made that argument in my civil society advocacy days about why it pays to do good, and it's a great argument and it's a very appealing argument, but it is not a perfect alignment. There is money to be made. At the very least, I think it's manifestly clear that there's money to be made by doing bad things, and likewise, the alignment between what is economically profitable and what is socially maximally beneficial to society is certainly imperfect. And there are areas where it makes financial sense to do something good. There are also areas where that's not the case, and certainly there are areas where it may make some sense, but it's not entirely worth the investment. And I kind of want to ask each of you, starting with Greg, what do companies gain from this? What do companies gain from participating in voluntary initiatives that support public transparency, that aim to improve their human rights record? Is this a PR exercise? Is this just about minimizing bad headlines and making that the people that work there feel not as terrible for working there? Or are there real, how do you spell out the real benefits to companies for doing good?
Yeah, well, I won't go full-throated in defense of this is always good in every circumstance, as you pointed out. I think I could probably add a couple of other reasons why companies might do some of this. A really good one right now, we could use the example of content moderation, is simply because it's going to be a lot cheaper to provide this information in a way that is aligned with how you gather data, as opposed to complying with what a couple of years from now could be literally dozens of regulations asking you to disclose things in slightly different ways. So we already are starting to see this with the German law NetzDG, which is kind of a very specific set of requirements for transparency around content moderation actions in Germany. I think it's every company's worst nightmare for there to be about another 111 NetzDGs out there for every interested government in around their content moderation actions, because they're going to bring their own definitions of the content categories. They're going to bring their own specialized requirements or legal requirements around, like, oh, well, we have to take things down within a certain amount of time, which I think we could have a separate conversation around why the time-sensitive nature of that is actually going to limit even more speech and be more harmful. But I think that's one highlight that I would really bring here, is that fending off potentially I think what they would love is the same way as you now see Facebook advocating for or many companies advocating for a national privacy law, is because they would rather deal with that than 50 state by state privacy initiatives. And they might even, of course, there's the cynical, I would say, that companies are probably going to look to really have the most influence in that national setting where they can, set that bar really nice and low. However, that there's clearly, from a cost of compliance perspective here, it's in their own financial interest to a certain extent to be transparent around a number of these elements. So that's one other reason. I'm certainly not going to go to bat on it being so in every case, but I think that's another one I'd throw in there.
Oh, that's a good point. Nip it in the bud before the regulatory hammer comes down, I think is an effective part of that. Lynn or Natalie, do you want to chime in?
Well, I think what companies get out of this, the principal thing they get out of it, is that they're allowed to be good. That, remember, these companies have human beings in them, and those human beings in the companies don't think about these situations much differently, probably, than we do. The Business Roundtable, for example, endorses all kinds of benefits for stakeholders. And my colleague, Steve Bainbridge, says, well, they don't speak for the companies when they say those things. And you don't see the companies doing those things. Well, the people are really something different from the company. And so even though this is mainly a PR exercise, it's also a chance for the people in the company to be the good guys. What would you rather be, the head of the company that is polluting the river or the head of the company that's cleaning up the river?
Natalie?
Yeah, I agree with all that. Though sometimes at least some CEOs would rather just be the CEO of the richest company and don't really care about the river, but can't change that aspect of human nature for everyone, I guess. What I'll add to that is that what we hear from companies a lot is that they find the specific standards on transparency that we provide them to be a really useful roadmap to how they should be organizing their transparency on various policies and processes and outcomes of those, and that they really appreciate not having to reinvent the wheel in terms of like, oh, so what is the data that we should be providing about, our data collection, or about what controls we give users on how to control the data that's collected about them, and so on. That, they don't always follow all of our recommendations. In fact, as you can see from the scores, no company follows all of our recommendations. But they do appreciate having this guidance, so that they know that, here's a set of standards that have a very high amount of buy-in from the international human rights community.
Yeah, I think that, and that point also, I think, potentially ties back to the standardization question that was raised earlier. Is there's real value if there are central groups that are connecting with all the different companies. That may help towards standardization, doesn't always help. As I've discovered, as I think we're all going to be familiar with, is the interoperability between these different disclosure structures can remain a challenge. But if they're at least saying the same types of information, or can get a bit of a roadmap of how to start on this stuff, that can be helpful. And also, I think that it's worth emphasizing Lynn's previous point about workforce pressures, which personally I'm fascinated about. I think that that's one of the sleeping giants of certainly of the tech sector, is the impact of employee pressure on corporate. As somebody who's not a private sector person myself, I've always found that fascinating in terms of the enormous potential for as a driver of change. I want to and sort of on that note of the standardization, do you think that there are aspects of the tech sector that make this challenge particularly thorny, either because the information is more difficult for the public at large to understand, or because there are there can be a greater disconnect between the levels of expertise of the people that are on the front lines of dealing with problems and outsiders that are kind of grappling with them. do you find that do any of you think that this is a challenge which is either unique to the tech sector or more pronounced in the tech sector? And what are some ways to mitigate that? Natalie, I see you nodding enthusiastically, so I'm going to call on you first.
Oh, that wasn't my enthusiastic face. You'll know my enthusiastic face when that happens. So there are two key areas where we found that disclosure was really, really low. These were new areas that we introduced for the index for the last iteration. The first is what we call algorithmic system use policies, which is a jargony way of saying that we're expecting companies to disclose under what circumstances they are going to use artificial intelligence or algorithmic systems to make decisions and implement those decisions across the products and services. And you can see there that there was a little bit more disclosure, but not a whole lot in the digital platform sector than for telecoms, although telcos do use AI for all kinds of reasons. And then the second, and so this is because I think this is, and I think it's difficult for companies to disclose this in part because this is relatively new. Like the AI revolution is really only a few years old when it comes to this sector, and two, because sometimes these systems are so complex, and because they tend to iteratively design themselves, the humans and the companies don't understand the systems well enough to explain how they work, which I personally find really scary. If you don't understand how a system works, how can you be sure that it's not going to hurt people, right? But even when they do understand, so they have to do first the work of understanding how they work, and then translated that into human readable language, and that's complicated. And then the second big area where we're not seeing nearly the disclosure that we'd like to see is when it comes to targeted advertising. We know that, I think most people in the audience will be familiar with the argument that the surveillance-based business model that's endemic in Silicon Valley and beyond creates a set of incentives for companies that ultimately lead to decision-making that goes against the public interest. And here again, I'll point to Frances Haugen's whistleblowing disclosures as kind of, receipts for that assertion. And so unsurprisingly, companies are really, really reluctant to show much about what goes on under the hood of their economic engine.
I'd love to just kind of hop on that, Natalie, because I think something that I was thinking about in preparing for the panel was one of the challenges here being that I think that we don't even really, so content moderation, so you have AI, I'd say right at the front of it, and content moderation, we're starting to get our arms around. But even if you go back to something like privacy, which has been in the collective understanding for a bit longer, maybe give it 5 more years, I mean, there's still not, we're starting to make progress, but I think if you look at it as an industry even, I don't think that professionals have a true set of best practices around this stuff. And so it's like, how do you have transparency if a lot of the practitioners don't even really have some kind of consensus on what good management looks like? I think that we're starting to get there, but it's kind of funny because you talk about, well, you need transparency in order for accountability. And there's almost like a chicken and the egg situation here where you also just don't really have a collective agreement, certainly not from regulators who normally would play a role here, completely absent. So now we have public policy, public interest groups kind of approaching the companies directly without necessarily the carrots and sticks that a regulator could have to really kind of set some guide rails here, right? So I think that's one of the challenges, is just how new a lot of this stuff is. I mean, other parts of it, I think, certainly apply to any sector, company concerns around how the information might be interpreted and stuff like that. I mean, that's always good. It doesn't matter what industry you're in for that. But I think one of the challenges here is that even for the more established elements of some of these things, that we don't, frankly, and I'd love to hear pushback from privacy practitioners if you disagree, but as far as I can tell, we're still really at the early days of even having a consensus from those practitioners in terms of what good practice looks like, what's acceptable practice, especially when you have fairly new laws. I mean, GDPR was it's there, but it's just barely getting enforced. So we really don't even know truly where the red lines are with a law like that yet, right? I mean, it's pretty new. So.
Yeah, I posted a link into the chat just on the privacy question of the privacy by design framework, just because we had Anne Kavukian virtually as one of our speakers a couple of weeks ago, and she plugged that enthusiastically. But even there, you have principles, but how you translate that into practice is a tricky thing. Sorry, Lynn, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with the remarks from Natalie and from Greg, but I also wanted to add that if we back up a little, it's probably not the tech sector that is different. I'm thinking that it's the social media sector that is different. If you imagine a company, if it's in manufacturing or a retailer, there's a big building and there are a few hundred people inside, and all of them are pursuing specific goals. They're a bunch of rules and understandings about what's going to happen. You go on social media, and there are billions of people with too much time on their hands, and they're making all sorts of trouble. And so if you're trying to control that, if that's what you're trying to make transparent, you've got a much bigger job, and the job gets larger still because of privacy. That privacy is virtually the opposite of transparency. You want to make something transparent, then you're going to do the very thing that the person on social media doesn't want done. You're going to invade their privacy by including them in the statistics as to what it is that's going on. You're not identifying them individually, but I don't think people care about that. They'd still feel targeted in groups. So I do think that the social media are working with a more difficult problem than the rest, than other industries are.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And I would add to that maybe the transnational and borderless nature of social media as part of that, where, you know, unlike if I have a widget factory and I'm deciding where my widgets are going to go and where I'm going to sell them and what machines are going to plug into or whatever, you know, it seems as if social media companies, you create a product and it sort of drifts. I'm sure they would dispute that, and that it's their growth strategies are much more targeted, but you release it into the wild and it moves in different places, and it sort of it takes on a life of its own in terms of its own growth and spread. And it, you know, I thought about a similar question in terms of developing human rights impact assessments on this kind of a process, and it's weird because, you know, the HRIA framework, not to take us onto that tangent, but the HRIA framework is designed around these particular decision points that are very identifiable, I think, in traditional business models, and much harder to pinpoint when you're talking about putting a website up or releasing an app or something like that. So we have some really interesting questions in the chat, which I want to start turning to at the moment. I have a bunch of questions myself as well, but I want to make sure we have a robust time for Q&A for folks that are interested. The first one is from Alessia, who asks, and I think this takes us back to the standardization questions that were raised earlier, and whether or not industry-wide standardized transparency requirements are a viable option to improve cross-comparison of social media companies. I'm going to break that up into two sort of mini questions, because I think that you can approach that either as a regulatory requirement. And so the question there is there, could governments really mandate proper standardized transparency disclosures that would provide effective and meaningful oversight on the content moderation space? And there's all kinds of questions around whether governments have or would employ the requisite expertise to design this stuff properly. Could it be done effectively as a regulatory requirement? And then I guess the second half of that question would be if this were done independently in a standardized way by a standard setting organization like like we have represented here, like how would that be structured if it were done as a sort of self-reporting framework? Does anybody want to tackle one or part of that? Maybe we'll start with Greg as the representative of one such standard setting organization.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, to answer the first question, like, yeah, is there a set of information or and specific metrics that would be standardized and comparable that companies could report to? I think so, yes. In short, will it be easy to get there? No, not particularly. But is it possible? Of course. This is work that I've been actively doing myself in terms of the voluntary side of things. What might these metrics look like? Of course, it's challenging in terms of the differences between platforms and the fact that the details matter, because the second you kind of start saying, oh, well, content removed. So it's like, well, what's content? Is it a YouTube comment? Is it a TikTok reel? Is it an entire account that you're banning? And just like the nature of the platform itself will impact the reporting. So I think at times it does kind of feel like you need a little bit of flexibility in there and maybe slightly more of a principles-based approach. But I think there's still all sorts of ways that you could kind of cut this information and present it as a company that's not that dissimilar to what they're already doing, that would still be very useful. And could be helpful for benchmarking as well. So I mean, we don't necessarily need to get into all of the individual data points that might be useful to either an investor audience or broader stakeholder audience. But I think if you think about content removals, how frequently was that content viewed before it was removed, I think is an interesting one that could be potentially used. Potentially percentages that were kind of like removed without anyone seeing it, which would also be kind of flagged by AI, some kind of understanding of where humans are in the chain and like how that relates to their their moderation practices. I mean, yeah, there's a ton of information that these companies already have, are collecting, are sitting on. Is there a way to standardize some of that? Yes, I don't see why not. I mean, it would have to be flexible, and it would also have to be kind of accounting for the fact that we probably don't really know what the next big platform is going to look like. And no one barely even knew what TikTok was 3 years ago, and I think it's at the center of a lot of concerns around child safety online now. So I mean, it really is and so moderation, yes, and then you get into algorithmic ranking and recommendations. I think that's a lot harder. Because it's really tough to understand between, you can kind of say, well, let's tell us what the 5 most important things are in terms of what appears on your news feed, or what video gets recommended to you. Like, is that possible? I don't know. I think you could at least ask companies to provide a narrative disclosure of what some of the the most important inputs are. That could be somewhat useful. It's not going to get at the engagement and enragement concerns that exist now, but I'm bullish, but I think I'm very biased because I'm actively trying to do some of this stuff. So if you have any ideas, don't shoot me an email.
Natalie or Lynn, I'm not sure what your thoughts are on standardization of information around stakeholder assessments or investor assessments, and whether there's potential utility there or what the challenges are.
What do you mean by investor assessments?
Oh, sorry. I just mean to ask, in considering avenues to invest or avenues for the public to patronize, how different sort of stakeholders, as you've identified, might find greater standardization of disclosures more or less useful in attempting to support responsible conduct in this space?
Well, I think view this as 2 separate parts. There's the disclosure to the investors, and then there's the disclosure to essentially everybody else. Maybe that would need to be broken down in addition. But the fact that one of the disclosures is happening doesn't interfere with the other one. I would favor doing both. And then as far as as this being viable in content moderation, I simply have no idea there.
Natalie, I know that's an area where you will have thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, same as with Greg, I've been working on standardizing expectations for these types of disclosures precisely so we can do comparisons like the Corporate Accountability Index. So yes, I do think it's possible. As far as government intervention, as you and I have discussed a lot, Michael, it really kind of hinges on this question of whether that's compelled speech or not. And I think ultimately the only way that's going to get resolved is if the U.S. Congress or the FTC decides to legislate or to regulate, and then someone challenges that, and then we eventually we get a court decision. I think that's the only way we're really going to know. But there is a lot of appetite in Congress and at the FTC right now to mandate certain types of transparency. The PACT Act in the 116th Congress was an example, and that folks on the Hill are looking to revise that language right now, actually.
We have another question from Hineko Sugiyama of Access Now, which is specifically directed at Greg and Lynn, and is on that question of single and double materiality. If we assume more investors take responsible avenues, can we accept that those two concepts will get closer, and to the extent that the distinction between them will be limited? Hineko notes that in their work at Access Now, there's curiosity about the pros and cons of using the term like double materiality, because it seems difficult for the SEC to take double materiality. Rather, to expand human rights disclosure in a more strategic way is to emphasize that investors are also becoming human rights centric, thereby encouraging human rights disclosure in the name of investor protection. I'm not sure if Greg or Lynn want to take that. Greg?
Yeah, I've got some thoughts. I mean, yeah, it's a really interesting point, and I think certainly if you take the example of the SEC, I mean, like there's like even the financial materiality is they are kind of hamstrung to a certain extent around and kind of heavily regulated by kind of what some kind of concept of what the reasonable investor is. And if you look back to some cases from the 70s around what was considered a reasonable investor, it was like, oh, a reasonable investor isn't concerned with environmental issues. That was literally a Supreme Court ruling back then. I think certainly that concept has come a long way in 50 years in terms of what someone might reasonably be interested in. So I think that is one area. I would say that the SEC probably not the best bet in any time soon in terms of rulemaking that would compel human rights oriented disclosures. I'm not very bullish on that anytime soon, compared to say like the mandate of something like the European Commission, like which I kind of said in the intro. It's a different mandate. That said, I think you are absolutely right that there is a continued blurring of this as more and more investors start taking a more holistic view around some of these things and have kind of multiple objectives in mind, not just financial returns. Because I think that there can be a bit of a false distinction there between somebody who's only interested in financial returns and is therefore thinking about long-term value creation, which includes issues like human rights and privacy and because of reputational impacts, et cetera, versus one who is more explicitly saying that they want this kind of baked in because human rights is not an ESG factor. It is within itself a noble and important thing to be considering for all companies. So I'm certainly in my conversations, especially with investors in Europe, I would say that they do kind of see the double materiality, single materiality thing is unhelpful and not really consistent with the way that they view their investment strategy. So I think it's likely that we are to continue to see evolution there, although perhaps the large global asset managers might be a little bit further behind. And those are some of the ones that really count when it comes to moving dollars around. And we're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars under management.
I see sharp differences between the interests of investors and the interests of other stakeholders and the public, particularly. When Frances Haugen was on television, watched her the first time, and she ended up with something about essentially that divisiveness makes money, and these companies don't care about people; they only care about making money. And at that point, I thought somebody should tell her the law. the law of Delaware is that a corporation must put money first. That's its legal obligation. The directors have a fiduciary duty to the corporation to put money first over those other interests. If a director said, well, I went ahead and canceled the divisiveness because it was harming the public. If they said that in a Delaware court, the answer would be they violated their fiduciary duties by doing that. So I'm not as optimistic that there's going to be a reconciliation between the interests of investors and the interests of the public at large. I go back to my earlier example. If the planet is destroyed, but no investor loses any money, is that mission accomplished?
And I guess I think that sort of takes us back to one of the questions that I had circulated earlier, which is to what extent are challenges in promoting responsible conduct baked into more modern corporate structures? Not to raise, I'm not sure if you see the red flag of socialist revolution coming up behind me, but like, I mean, when we talk about these problems, I think that there is this fundamental question of whether Facebook or any of these companies, by maximizing profit and taking that very, very pure approach to maximizing revenue, maximizing shareholder value, to what extent are they just doing their job and just doing what they were designed to do? And if that's the case, then are there potentially reforms to corporate regulation that might help to address this?
Well, first of all, let me say that Delaware is the only state that clearly says shareholder wealth maximization is an obligation of the directors. The problem is with Delaware law in particular. And we can't get at that problem in Delaware law because none of us get to vote and none of us have any influence over the Delaware legislature or the Delaware courts. Under the internal affairs doctrine, corporations can incorporate anywhere they want, and then that law, the place where they incorporate it, is the only law that applies to what's called their internal affairs, which are the very things we're talking about. How ruthless are they in dealing with the public and seeking to make money? So it's something really deeply embedded in corporate law, but it's identifiable. And 49 other states are not doing it. It's just that there aren't very many corporations formed in those other 49 states.
That's a really good point, and that has me thinking about what kinds of advocacy strategies and campaigns people in civil society might create to target the governor and state legislators in Delaware, maybe even certain former senators from Delaware who may have an outsized voice in public discourse these days.
I was just thinking that who do we know who's a prominent Delawarean who might have some stuff there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. But also, to your point, Lynn, about Frances Haugen, needing to be reminded that the law obligates companies to prioritize returns on shareholder investments. I think if indeed she is confused on that point, I think we can blame her former boss for that confusion, right? Because Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg in particular has always made a really big deal of how, like, oh yeah, we're a private company and we're raking in money by the truckloads, but we're really in this to connect the world. And I'm reading Stephen Levy's excellent book about Facebook, which is titled Facebook right now, and he does a really good job of showing how from the very beginning, like Zuckerberg, and it's impossible to know to what extent somebody's buying their own BS, but to what extent they believe the things that they say, but that there's this humanitarian mission at Facebook, right? And talking to people who work there or who have previously worked there, you get a sense that they don't realize that they're an advertising company. Like 99% of their income comes from advertising, but nobody who works there seems to have any kind of opinion or involvement in managing the business of advertising, right? I've spent years trying to get in touch with the team that's in charge of verifying that the only ads that run on Facebook are ads that follow the Facebook rules, right? There's a whole bunch of, there are laws that apply to advertisement, but there's also Facebook rules that are much more specific and much more restrictive than the ones for user content that apply to ads. But it's really hard to figure out to what extent those are actually enforced or who's in charge of enforcing, right? And so there's this real disconnect of this company in particular, but I think the same is true for other social media giants between what their business actually is, how they make money, versus how they perceive themselves and how they portray themselves to the public, which has to do with their user-facing unpaid products and services that, to put it in economic terms, are really just the means to generate data and advertising inventory to serve the targeted advertising business. So it's understandable that people like Frances Haugen are confused about what the purpose of Facebook is, because I don't think Facebook itself is really clear on what it is.
Yeah, I want to kind of back up. Yeah, sorry, I want to back up and push back a little bit on this fiduciary duty thing, and with deference to those with true expertise in this area, because I'm certainly not a lawyer. However, my understanding of Delaware law in that context would be, as long as the board of directors and the CEO could show that they genuinely believed that a decision that they made was in the long-term interests of their shareholders, they're going to do just fine in court, right? I mean, so the idea that, as long as companies could say, yes, we just doubled our investment in content moderation in Africa because we were concerned with, we were concerned by some of the externalities there. We thought that this actually posed risks to our business in terms of reputational damage and other outcomes that would have been bad. And we believed that it was worth that investment, even though it maybe was an expensive investment in the short term, that in the long term, that was the better option for our company to avoid the horrifying outcomes, headlines, et cetera. Would they get sued for that and lose? I think of Jack Dorsey doing something similar in 2018. Twitter's share price went down by 25% at an earnings call when they said, we are purging our platform of all these fake accounts, and we're going to make a number of other changes that impact user engagement. We think this is good for the long-term health of our platform, and it's the right call. They didn't get sued. They didn't end up in jail. They didn't lose their job. So I just wanted to push back a little bit, and Lynn, I'm curious as to your reaction, but that's always been my understanding of this. As long as management can show that they felt that they were acting in the long-term interest of the shareholders, regardless of short-term implications on cash flow or share price, that they're going to be in the clear when it comes to being sued in court.
Well, you're right in saying that if it's in the long-term interest of the corporation, that the directors are entitled to do that, and they're in accord with their fiduciary duties. But the long-term interests of the corporation are defined as shareholder wealth maximization. In other words, the argument has to be, we're going to make these social improvements, and eventually, we don't have to tell you when, because we're Delaware directors and we have total discretion of everything, but eventually this will make money. And if they say, no, I'm not maintaining it's going to make money eventually, I'm maintaining that it's the right thing to do and I feel a moral obligation to do it, whack. That's a shareholder lawsuit. They lose on that one. So it's not a rule. What I'm saying is it's not a rule that is enforced against the directors, but it is an ideal that is set up for the directors. And anyone who speaks against that ideal, as a few people have, Craig of Craigslist, in the eBay
Craig
case,
Newmark, yeah, Craig Newmark.
Yeah, if they voice that interest in running a different kind of company, then they're in trouble.
So there's a question in the chat about social media, content moderation, and transparency, and in terms of transparency of blocking. And it seems to specifically be asking about what we know and what we don't know in terms of what the rules are, how the rules are applied, who is being blocked. That's specifically directed to Natalie, and I think you're certainly a good person to jump in at the outset on the transparency gaps that exist, particularly when you think jurisdiction to jurisdiction, or how rules are or what rules there are that are applied in different jurisdictions. So maybe I'll pass that to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much for this great question, Ina. So, I think my personal belief, and this should not detract from platforms' constitutional right to moderate platforms as they see fit, right? They get to have, the platforms get to have their own rules, right? If I run a platform that only likes that only wants to admit dog people, and somebody comes in to talk about how wonderful cats are, that platform gets to ban people because they like cats, right? I don't think that is a business that would go very far, but that's their right, constitutionally speaking. I personally think that blocking should be a last resort. Blocking an account or deleting somebody's account should be a last resort. After following a clearly established process with multiple strikes, so to speak, clear notification to the user about what the rules are, what rule they've broken, what the consequence will be if they break it again, and so on and so forth. And that's what incidentally, that's what the Facebook Oversight Board went back to Facebook and said with respect to their decision to block former President Trump, because while the Oversight Board agreed that, what the types of incitement and behavior that that the former president was exhibiting on the platform certainly merited expulsion, that there was nothing in Facebook's code of conduct for users and its community guidelines that laid out the course of action that Facebook did. It was kind of like, you can't just make up rules when the case emerges, you have to have rules ahead of time, and so on. And I agree with that. So I think it's really important to have the rules ahead of time, to be really transparent and clear to the user, and so on. Nobody should be blocked or have their content removed without being told why that's the case, right? And that's something that companies are definitely struggling to do. And something that I think those of us in civil society and beyond who follow platforms closely have known for a long time, but that the Haugen disclosures really proved, is that as dodgy as Facebook is when it comes to its US user base, it's dramatically worse in other parts of the world. There's something like 80% of the of resources spent on integrity, which basically is Facebook speak for keeping the platform safe for its users, is spent in the US, leaving only 20% for everywhere else, and that's just unconscionable. So there is a real need for industry independent research into all these processes to figure out exactly what Facebook is doing, how it's doing it, and what the gaps are between what it claims it's doing and what it's actually doing. So the question is, how do we enable that kind of industry independent research? And I say industry independent because while there are really solid research teams within Facebook, we know from the Haugen disclosures in particular that their findings and their recommendations are being blocked by the company's top executives. So your question is, why can't we know publicly who's getting blocked? Now, the first reason we can't know that is because Facebook won't tell us. That's the first reason. The second reason is that even if Facebook were willing to or were compelled to publish detailed lists of which accounts were blocked for what reason, what languages they tend to post in, what geographic areas they tend to log in from, and so on, that would be a really huge violation of the privacy of the individuals in question. And so that's just not possible. And it's not just privacy in principle, but it's really a matter of safety. In the question, you point to the case of activists and human rights defenders in the MENA region or in other regions whose accounts are often being shut down at the instigation of the governments in those areas, right? One of the things that that Haugen's whistleblowing documents showed was the formerly secret agreement between Facebook and the government of Vietnam, where basically Facebook said, sure, we'll take down more civil society activist, dissident accounts if you continue to let us operate in the country, right? Which I think is immoral, right? I'm not sure how the people involved in that agreement sleep at night. I hope they don't. But we don't want those people's information exposed, because that's only going to make life more dangerous for them. But I think it would be really great if there were a system through which vetted, qualified researchers, and determining how they're vetted, who vets them, what qualified means, and so on is a huge question that I'm just going to set aside for right now. Would be able to have access to this kind of information that's too sensitive to be made totally public, but too important to be left entirely, with only the company having access to it, would be really great. And so there's a bunch of researchers from civil society and academia who are in conversation with various folks in Congress right now, trying to work out what kind of legislative framework could help create such a researcher data access mechanism, and I think that in turn would really facilitate evidence-based policymaking in a whole host of areas related to platform regulation. But it's a difficult question, to be sure.
We're going to need a lot of transparency that we don't have right at this point in order to do those things. And I wanted to mention that Michael has written a very interesting paper about one possible way of getting some of that transparency, and it is essentially a FOIA type regime that would apply, just as it applies to the government today, would apply in many respects to these private companies as well. They would be posting what information they have, I assume, and people could request that information, and they would have an obligation to make it available with a presumption that all of it's going to be posted online, so they're not going to spend much time dealing with individual people. And it sounds like an interesting route to pursue.
Yeah, thank you for that. There is also some interesting work being done either as it's either as part of the digital, I think it's part of the Digital Services Act, but within the EU, there's some work being done around accredited researcher access to raw data, not specifically on this issue, but in order to create a mechanism to allow academics and civil society researchers to access this data that doesn't entail dependence on the platforms with all the problems that are potentially coming with that. We only have a couple of minutes left, but there's another really interesting question in the chat from Mike Nelson, who asks first about the privacy transparency tension, which I think has been addressed by Natalie. The other aspect of that, which I had originally circulated as well, is around the questions around trade secrets and commercial confidentiality, which I think is a really interesting area. It's an area that I know a little bit about in the FOIA space, but much less in the sort of in this area. I'm sure I imagine that's something that Greg grapples with. So I would be interested in hearing his thoughts on that, and then maybe to anyone else that wants to chime in.
Yeah, I mean, we grapple with it in that we have released a set of standards and some metrics just get very little pickup. What is interesting is even the ones where we hear from some companies saying, absolutely not, no way, you'll still see in the market as if we continue to adopt, and some companies are willing to do it. So it really depends on the market and the context. I think it also depends on sensitivities around, peer pressure is just so big in the corporate disclosure space, broadly speaking. Once a company sees that its competitors are disclosing to whether there are standards or someone else's, there is immediately like, oh well, why, who's doing what, how are they doing it exactly, like that. All the details really matter. But I think getting a few folks out there who are willing to kind of disclose information up front can be really helpful in kind of dispelling some of that if you feel that it's not really like that. There are some topics that are there conceivably is a first mover disadvantage. I think a good example could potentially be Uber, which released a sexual assault report about its platform. I actually thought that was quite brave of them to do, because They went out there and went public. They developed a methodology with a bunch of, with external organization, civil society organizations around how to structure it, what to put in there. And every single headline that I saw was overwhelmingly negative about how much sexual assault was on Uber's platform. Lyft was nowhere to be seen at the time. They didn't have to do it, but they went out there and did it. So I think there can be I do respect the fact that there can be, like, cybersecurity, some of these other areas, potential downsides to moving first. And that's why I think some of this does eventually just have to come. We need regulatory support in particular. So I think it's something to consider. I don't have a great answer. I think it's sometimes you can take them seriously, and other times maybe not as much. So
we're just about out of time, but I want to make sure that Lynn and Natalie get a chance to respond on this before we wrap.
Well, I think there's really a very fundamental conflict between privacy and transparency. A lot of useful, relevant information to know how society works is information that relates to particular people. We have today a demand for an almost absolute privacy that dominates the media. When I was growing up, there was a book that was made by a company for every neighborhood, and it told who lived in the house and who the children were, et cetera. Unthinkable that you could produce something like that today. Unthinkable that your neighbors could know your name, know who you are. And if a lot of that is just unnecessary, as the existence of those books shows, it's not necessary, but people want it. And if they get it, then transparency is not going to go very far. I think we can do with a lot less privacy than is being demanded. I personally don't care whether big companies know what I bought when I went to the grocery store. I'm hoping that will cause them to actually have the things I want to buy in the grocery store.
Well, that is a very thought-provoking place to end it. I have thoughts, but we are at time. I've enormously enjoyed this conversation. And I think that it was a really valuable look at a lot of the transparency challenges, which are so important and so fundamental to answering these broader questions around corporate social responsibility. I won't keep our wonderful panelists any longer, since I've already stolen 2 minutes that I wasn't meant to. But Lynn, Greg, and Natalie, thank you so much for your participation here, which is enormously appreciated. I'll give a quick plug for our next event, which is going to be on December 1st as part of the launch of the Journal of Free Speech Law, which will feature Jack Balkin, Daphne Keller, Eugene Volokh, and Mark Lemley, which is going to be a great conversation. And I'll also mention that this is actually the first in a series that we're going to be putting on, a series of panels that we're going to be putting on transparency in tech. So stay tuned for more information about that. And thanks again to all of our panelists, and thanks to our audience for coming out and for asking fantastic questions. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.